My dad started dating my mom's sister after she passed away, then he kicked me out. Now they have a baby and want me back. It's been years now, but I still remember the day everything changed. My mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. It all started with a routine checkup, just a standard doctor's visit, nothing out of the ordinary. She felt fine. No warning signs, no reason to worry. But then, during the exam, they found a lump. She came home that day clutching her test results, her face pale and unreadable. Over and over, she kept saying there had to be a mistake, that this couldn't be happening. It was like she thought if she said it enough times, it would somehow undo everything. I was just a teenager then, too young to grasp the weight of what was coming. Cancer was a word I had heard before, but I had no idea how it could unravel a family, how it could reach into our lives and turn everything inside out. Mom wasn't convinced at first. She saw 3 different doctors, hoping one of them would tell her something different. But they all came back with the same answer. One afternoon, I got home from school and found her on the floor, crying. I stood there, confused. She had always been the strongest person I knew. I kept asking her what was wrong, but she wouldn't answer. She just sat there, exhausted in a way I had never seen before. That night, she sat me and my dad down in the living room and told us the truth. She had breast cancer, and soon, she'd be starting chemotherapy. My dad. I don't even know how to describe the way he reacted. It was like watching him fall apart in slow motion. His face just collapsed. And then, nothing. He didn't say a single word. Not one. Just sat there in complete silence. Mom, on the other hand, held herself together. She even managed to smile at me, that soft, reassuring kind of smile meant to keep me from falling apart too. She told me not to worry. She was going to fight. I wanted to believe her. But the fear had already started creeping in. That night, I locked myself in my room and turned to the only thing that felt like it could give me answers: Google. I spent hours clicking through pages, reading every terrifying fact I could find. Stages, chemotherapy, survival rates. Every word seemed worse than the last. I felt like I was drowning in information I didn't know how to process. I didn't know how to help her. I didn't know how to help us. I was just a kid, and the weight of it all felt impossible to carry. The months that followed were some of the darkest I'd ever known. My mom, the person I had always seen as unbreakable, was suddenly in the fight of her life. And no matter how much strength she had, the disease was relentless. I watched her change before my eyes. She lost weight, her body growing frail. The warm glow she always carried seemed to fade. Some days, she was too exhausted to even lift her head off the pillow. And the chemo, it was brutal. It drained her, stripped her down physically and emotionally. It felt like no matter how hard she fought, cancer was always one step ahead. But the hardest moment, the one that still haunts me, was the day I walked into the bathroom and saw her standing in front of the mirror, shaving her head. Her golden hair, the hair she had always been so proud of, was falling out in clumps because of the chemo. She didn't wait for it to all fall away on its own. She took control, gripping the razor with a shaking hand, tears slipping down her face as she shaved off the rest. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching her reflection tremble in the mirror. I wanted to help. I wanted to say something, anything, that would make it better. But what do you say to someone when their identity, everything they see in themselves, is being stripped away, and there's nothing you can do to stop it? And my dad? He wasn't there. Not really. He had checked out long before things got this bad. He was never the kind of man to express his emotions, not in the good times, and certainly not in the worst of them. He bottled everything up, buried it deep, and even as my mom was going through hell, he stayed locked inside his own silence. I could tell, in my own way, that he was hurting too. But he never said anything. Never told her, never told me. He never went with her to chemo. Never sat with her after she lost her hair. She begged him to be there for her, but he just wasn't. At dinner, he would sit in silence, staring at his plate like he wasn't even in the room. After work, he'd disappear into his workshop for hours, locking himself away from the world. And the worse things got, the further he pulled away from us. When my mom finally lost her battle with cancer, when she was gone for good, our family shattered completely. That was the first time I ever saw my dad cry. Not just cry, break. He sobbed like I had never seen before, like every emotion he had buried deep inside was finally forcing its way out. For just one day, he felt like my father again. And in that moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, this could be the thing that finally brings us together. That we could lean on each other, share our grief, and somehow find a way to heal. But that's not what happened. Not even close. Instead, my dad fell apart. He let the grief consume him until the only way he knew how to deal with it was to drown himself in alcohol. He started drinking every day, at first just enough to take the edge off, but before long, it became his entire existence. He'd disappear for hours, sometimes the whole day, spending his time in bars, drinking himself into oblivion. When I got home from school, the house would be empty. Quiet. The kind of quiet that felt suffocating. It wasn't home anymore. Mom was gone, and Dad, well, it felt like I had lost him too. Most nights, I'd rummage through the kitchen, looking for whatever scraps of food were left. Grocery shopping wasn't something he did anymore. Bread and jam became my usual dinner because it was all we had. I still remember the empty feeling of sitting at the kitchen table alone, trying to eat in the thick, heavy silence, pretending like it didn't feel like the walls were closing in. But the worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was what happened when my dad did come home. Most of the time, he didn't walk through the door on his own. It was strangers, random people I had never seen before, dragging him inside because he was too drunk to stand. I'd watch as they propped him up, his body limp, his words slurred, his eyes barely open. It was humiliating. It was heartbreaking. And the worst part? He never talked to me anymore. It was like he had disappeared completely, leaving me behind in the wreckage. My dad never once asked how I was doing. Not after Mom died. Not in the months that followed. It was like I didn't exist to him anymore, like I had faded into the background, just another part of the house he could ignore. Some days, he wouldn't even look at me, as if seeing me was too much, as if my face was a painful reminder of everything we had lost. I often wondered if he blamed himself for not being there for her, for not stepping up when she needed him most. But he never said a word about it. He never talked about his guilt or regret, if he even felt any at all. His silence made me feel like I had lost both of my parents, not just one. Then, about a year and a half after Mom passed, her sister, Tessa, came into our lives. She had just gotten a job in town and needed a place to stay while she searched for an apartment. When she asked if she could move in temporarily, my dad wasn't thrilled about the idea. He was resistant to pretty much everything back then. But I was the one who convinced him to let her stay. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. At the time, I thought it would be a good thing. I figured having someone else around the house, someone who wasn't drowning in grief, might help. Honestly, I was just relieved to have an adult there who wasn't miserable and broken like my dad. What I didn't know then was how much things were about to change. If I had, I never would have suggested it. At first, having Tessa around was exactly what I needed. She reminded me so much of my mom, full of energy, always moving, always talking. She made my favorite meals, something I hadn't had since Mom passed, and sitting down to a real dinner again felt almost foreign, like I was rediscovering what it was like to be part of a family. She didn't ignore me the way my dad did. She asked about school, my friends, my life. She told me stories about her and my mom growing up together, sharing memories that made me feel close to her in a way I hadn't since she died. She'd pull out old photo albums, flipping through pictures of Mom smiling, laughing, full of life. It was comforting, being around someone who understood what I was going through and actually cared enough to help. But as time went on, something started shifting. Tessa and my dad were spending more and more time together. At first, I thought nothing of it. She was helping him, I told myself. And God knew he needed help. She was the only person who could reach him. The only one who could get through to him in a way I never could. She urged him to stop drinking, to start living again, to be there not just for me, but for himself. And somehow, he actually listened to her. For months, I had watched him spiral further and further into his grief. But suddenly, he was staying home more, sitting with us at the dinner table instead of disappearing to the bar. Tessa convinced him to watch movies with us, little things that made us feel like a family again. She even got him to ask about my day now and then, something he hadn't done in what felt like forever. And when she nudged him to come to one of my school games, he actually showed up. For the first time since Mom died, I thought maybe, just maybe, things were getting better. I was so convinced that Tessa staying with us was the best thing to happen in a long time that I started dreading the day she'd move out. I'd drop little hints, asking if she had found an apartment yet, secretly hoping she hadn't. I wanted her to stay because she was the only one who could pull my dad out of the darkness. She was fixing us. Or at least, that's what I believed. I had no idea what was really happening. One afternoon, I came home from school, tossing my bag onto the floor like I always did. But as I walked into the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing by the counter where we used to eat together as a family, were my dad and Tessa. Wrapped up in each other. Kissing. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. But it was. They froze the moment they saw me. My dad's face went pale, and in an instant, he was rushing toward me, stammering, apologizing, trying to explain. But I couldn't hear any of it. My stomach twisted into knots, a sick feeling rising up in my throat. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out of there. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. My mind kept replaying that awful image of them together. My dad. My mom's sister. How? How could they do this? How could she do this? Tessa, who had sat with me, shared stories about my mom, cooked her recipes, kept her memory alive, was now kissing her husband like my mom had never even existed. It hadn't even been that long. They had shared a life together. A family. And Tessa knew better than anyone how much my parents had loved each other. What they had meant to each other. What my mom had gone through in her final days. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a violation. Eventually, my dad found me sitting on the curb in front of the grocery store. He tried to talk to me, to convince me to come home, but I wouldn't even look at him. When we finally got back to the house, they both sat me down, acting like they owed me some kind of explanation. They told me they still loved my mom. That nothing would ever change that. But over time, they had developed feelings for each other. They couldn't help it, they said. And then my dad had the nerve to call it moving on, like that should somehow make it okay. Like I was supposed to just accept it and move forward. But Tessa, she was worse. She had the audacity to tell me that instead of being upset, I should be happy for my dad. That he was finally finding some peace after losing my mom. I snapped. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I screamed at her. I told her she was my mom's sister. That she was supposed to be loyal to her, not kissing her husband after she was gone and trying to make me accept it. I asked her if she had even stopped to think about how my mom would feel. If she had even considered what she was doing to her memory. For the first time, Tessa looked ashamed. For a brief moment, I saw the guilt flash across her face. But my dad, he didn't see it that way. He got angry. Furious. He yelled at me. Told me I had no right to speak to Tessa that way. That I was just a child, and their relationship was none of my business. Then he grounded me. Grounded me. As if I was the one who had done something wrong. As if I was the one who had betrayed my family. I had never felt so hurt. So angry. So disgusted. I ran to my room, slammed the door shut, and collapsed onto my bed, sobbing. I couldn't wrap my head around it, couldn't understand how my dad and Tessa could do this, how they could act like everything was normal. I kept hoping I'd wake up and realize it was just some awful nightmare, but it wasn't. And as much as I wanted things to stop spiraling, they only got worse. Over the next few weeks, they stopped even pretending to hide their relationship. Their affection became more obvious, more casual, as if I was supposed to just accept it and move on, like they had. It made my skin crawl watching them. Tessa, who had once been my source of comfort, now acting like she belonged here, like she had every right to take over my mother's place. And then, little by little, she did take over. At first, it was small things. Tessa had been staying in the guest room when she first moved in, but I started noticing her things appearing in their room, my parents' room. The room where my mom and dad had built a life together, the room that still carried her presence, was now being overtaken by Tessa piece by piece. Then, it became more obvious. She moved in completely, taking over the space that had once belonged to my mother like it had never been hers to begin with. And then she started erasing her. It began with the framed photos. My mom's smiling face, the pictures that had always decorated our home, started vanishing one by one. I'd come home from school and another one would be gone, shoved into storage like she was an old piece of furniture nobody needed anymore. Then it was her things, her favorite chair, her little trinkets, the small pieces of her that made our house feel like home. All of it disappeared, as if Tessa was determined to wipe away every trace of her existence. I felt like I was losing my mother all over again. Tessa, the person who once made me feel safe, now felt like an intruder. She walked around the house like it belonged to her, making changes without even considering how I felt. And every time I tried to protest, every time I tried to hold on to something of my mom, Tessa would complain to my dad. She'd tell him I was being difficult, that I wasn't listening, that I was making things harder for them. And my dad? He always took her side. Every single time. He acted like I was the problem. Like my grief was some kind of inconvenience in his new life with Tessa. He'd tell me I needed to let her take care of me, that I needed to stop fighting her. And if I dared to push back, if I so much as argued, he'd snap, accusing me of being unreasonable, of stirring up trouble for no reason. It felt like a complete betrayal. This was my dad, the man who was supposed to protect me, who should have understood how I felt. But instead of standing by me, instead of letting me process things in my own way, he shut me out. He let Tessa erase my mom, and in doing so, he erased me too. Then, one evening, the fighting reached a breaking point. Tessa crossed a line I never thought she'd even consider crossing. She wanted me to move out of my own bedroom. The room I had grown up in. The only space that still felt like mine. She told me I needed to move into the guest room because she needed more space for her work, for her exercise, for whatever ridiculous excuse she had come up with. I was stunned. I argued that if she needed space, she should use the guest room, but she dismissed that idea immediately, saying it was too small for her needs. And then, she had the nerve, the absolute nerve, to tell me that the guest room would be perfect for me because I'd be moving out in a couple of years when I turned 18 anyway. As if I was just temporary. As if my life, my space, my feelings didn't matter because soon enough, I'd be gone. Her words left me speechless. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I went straight to my dad, desperate for him to step in, to do something. I explained how unfair this was, how unreasonable Tessa was being, how this wasn't just about a room, it was about everything she had taken from me, from us. But he didn't care. He barely even listened. Instead, he dismissed me completely, acting like I was overreacting, like I was making a big deal out of nothing. Our argument escalated fast. I just couldn't understand, why did he keep siding with her? Why did he refuse to stand up for me, his own daughter? And then, before I could even stop myself, the words that had been gnawing at me for months finally burst out. Why do you hate me so much? I yelled, my voice shaking, every ounce of my pain spilling over. I needed an answer. I needed something to explain why he had been treating me this way since Mom died. And he gave it to me. Without a second of hesitation, without even blinking, he looked me in the eye and said, "Because you remind me of your mother too much. You talk like her. You look like her. I hate seeing your expressions all day." It felt like a punch straight to my gut. I froze. My own father, the man who was supposed to love me no matter what, had just admitted that he couldn't stand the sight of me because I reminded him of the woman he had supposedly loved the most. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The pain was unbearable. And before I even knew what I was saying, the words tumbled out. I wish it had been you who died instead of Mom. The second they left my mouth, I regretted them. But it was too late. The damage was done. My dad's face twisted with rage. And before I could even react, before I could take it back, his hand slammed across my face. The impact knocked the breath out of me. I stumbled back, my cheek burning from the slap. But the physical pain was nothing compared to what I felt inside. He had never hit me before. Not once. But at that moment, something between us shattered completely. I broke down sobbing, my entire body shaking. I felt destroyed. And I knew right then and there I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I couldn't live in a place where I was constantly reminded of my mom's absence, where Tessa was erasing her like she had never existed. I couldn't live under the same roof as a father who had not only failed me, but who had just hurt me in the worst possible way. I had nowhere to go. No one to turn to. Except for one person. The only family member I could think of who might help me. My Uncle Elliot. Elliot was my dad's younger brother. He had always been the fun uncle, the one who cracked jokes, played games, made family gatherings bearable. And now, I could only hope that he would be the one to save me from the mess my life had become. My Uncle Elliot had always been the laid-back, easygoing type, the kind of person who could make any situation feel lighter just by being there. He was kind, funny, and always made family gatherings a little more bearable. We had always gotten along well, but until that moment, I had never really thought of him as someone I could lean on. When I reached out to him, I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know exactly what I was asking for. All I knew was that I needed help, and I prayed that Elliot could offer it. So I told him everything. I laid it all out, the mess with my dad and Tessa, how I felt like I was being erased from my own home, and, finally, the part that scared me the most, how my dad had hit me. Elliot didn't hesitate. The first thing he did was reassure me that I wasn't crazy for feeling the way I did. He told me that what my dad and Tessa had done was wrong, that my feelings were valid, and that none of this was my fault. And then he promised me, swore to me, that he would take care of everything. The very next day, he showed up at our house, ready for a fight. I was upstairs when I heard them arguing, Elliot and my dad. I sat on my bed, gripping my knees, my heart pounding as their voices rose from downstairs. Elliot was furious. He didn't hold back. I heard him tearing into my dad, his voice sharp and full of disgust as he called him out for everything, for disrespecting my mom's memory, for mistreating me, for failing me as a father. He listed off every way my dad had let me down, every single thing he should have done differently. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was finally on my side. Apparently, Elliot hadn't just confronted my dad, he had also told my paternal grandparents about everything that had been going on. They had no idea about my dad's relationship with Tessa. And once they found out, they were livid. My grandparents had always been traditional, and the idea of their son getting involved with their late daughter-in-law's sister was absolutely disgusting to them. They called my dad immediately, berating him for his choices, for how much he had let things spiral out of control. Between Elliot's confrontation and the pressure from my grandparents, my dad finally relented. In the end, it was decided that I would move in with Elliot, at least for now. My dad needed to sort things out with Tessa, and I wasn't going to stick around to see what that meant. He told me the decision almost coldly, like it didn't even matter. Like he was just passing off a responsibility he didn't want anymore. He informed me, in the most detached way possible, that he would be paying Elliot a certain amount every month to cover my expenses. That was it. That was all I got. I couldn't believe how fast everything happened, but at the same time, I didn't care. Staying with my dad was no longer an option. I felt completely detached from him by that point. I had already lost him, this was just making it official. So when Elliot told me to pack my things, I did it without hesitation. And that was the last time I ever lived under my father's roof. Since the day I moved in with Elliot and his girlfriend, Marina, they've been my family. It's been 2 years now, and living with them has been a completely different experience. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was in a home that felt safe. A home where I was wanted. Elliot and Marina have given me the love, stability, and support I had been craving for so long. Marina, especially, she has this warmth about her, the kind that makes you feel like you belong just by being near her. And for the first time in years, I actually felt that. My paternal grandparents visit me regularly, and they've been there for me in ways my dad never was. They don't talk much about what happened with him and Tessa, but I know they all disapprove of their relationship. My dad, on the other hand, has been almost completely absent from my life since I left. At first, he tried to call me, tried to reach out, but I never had much to say to him. I didn't put in the effort, and eventually, he stopped calling altogether. And just like always, he blamed me, said I was the one pushing him away. And maybe I was. But he had made his choices. And I had made mine. It still hurts sometimes. But I've found people who care. And that's what has helped me move forward. Then, recently, something happened that I didn't expect. My grandparents had come over to visit me at Elliot's place, and I overheard them whispering about something they clearly didn't want me to hear. I listened closely, and that's when I caught it. Apparently, my dad and Tessa had a baby together. I froze. A baby. The words felt surreal, like they didn't even belong to reality. From what I could gather, no one had even known Tessa was pregnant, my dad had kept it completely under wraps. And now, he was suddenly reaching out to everyone, trying to get them to meet the baby, trying to pull them back into his life. But nobody wanted anything to do with him. Not my grandparents. Not Elliot. No one. Even Tessa's side of the family, my mom's side, had cut ties with her. I hadn't spoken to my mom's relatives much since everything happened, but hearing that they had turned their backs on Tessa too? That hit differently. It made me feel something I hadn't expected. Validation. Like I wasn't crazy for feeling the way I did. Like I wasn't the only one who saw how wrong this was. It felt good knowing that both sides of my family, paternal and maternal, still stood by my mom's memory. That they hadn't accepted what Tessa and my dad had done. That they refused to be part of it. I didn't dwell on it too much after that. But then, imagine my surprise. Yesterday, out of the blue, my dad called me. Seeing his name on my screen after 2 years of near silence felt unreal. For a second, I just stared at it, debating whether to even pick up. But curiosity got the better of me. His voice was strangely casual, like we had spoken just last week. He started by telling me he missed me. I almost laughed. Hearing those words from him after everything felt like a bad joke. But I let him talk, waiting to see where this was going. Then he said he had good news. I didn't respond. But deep down, I already had a sinking feeling I knew what he was about to say. And then he said it. He and Tessa had a baby. And he wanted me to meet my little brother. The sheer audacity of it left me speechless for a moment. Did he actually believe that this baby, his new family, would somehow erase the past? That inviting me to meet his child would magically fix what he had broken? I scoffed. I couldn't help it. Then I told him, flat out, that the baby wasn't my sibling. That he had no right to call me now, when he hadn't given a damn about me before. That's when he started arguing. He said he wanted me to come back home. That we could put the family back together. That all I had to do was give him another chance. And that was when I finally saw it for what it was. This wasn't about me. It never had been. Where was this concern when I needed him most? Where was this so-called fatherly love when he and Tessa were pushing me out of my own home, treating me like a burden? Now that they had a baby, now that they were the ones being shunned, he suddenly wanted to make things right? It was almost laughable. I told him no. Flat out no. That's when he got angry. He accused me of holding a grudge, said my mom would be disappointed in me for not showing any grace. He claimed that Tessa and his baby deserved to have a loving, supportive family around them, and that I should be the bigger person. I hung up. Update 1, the realization. For those asking, I'm turning 18 this year, which means I'm not legally tied to my dad anymore. I'm no longer a dependent. Elliot has been more of a father to me than my actual dad ever was, and there's no way he'd let my dad force me back into that house. I told Elliot about the call, just so he'd be prepared if my dad tried to pull anything. And honestly, after reading through so many of your comments, I completely agree, this isn't about me. My dad doesn't actually want me back. He wants me as a prop. He wants me there to make it look like he has a normal, functioning family. To make himself feel better. To prove to everyone that everything is just fine. I do feel bad for the baby, but I have zero sympathy for my dad. He's trying to manipulate me into forgiving him. And that's never going to happen. Update 2, the confrontation. A week passed. And then today, my dad showed up unannounced at Elliot's house. Elliot and Marina tried to keep him outside, but he wouldn't stop yelling, demanding to see me. So I went downstairs. I told him to stop yelling in front of the neighbors. That's when the guilt tripping started again. He stood there, face flushed with frustration, telling me how much he regretted what he did. How he wished I would just come back home. How we could be a family again. I stared at him, feeling nothing. So I told him, as calmly as I could, that Elliot and Marina were my family now. That I wasn't going anywhere. That's when the mask slipped. He admitted that ever since I left, his entire family, his parents, his siblings, everyone had basically shunned him and Tessa. That even now, with the baby here, they still wouldn't accept them. That no one had even bothered to meet his child. And then he turned on me. He called me selfish. Said all I had to do was come back home and show everyone we were still a family, and maybe they'd start accepting him again. That's when I lost it. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Dad, I'm done with you. I've been done with you since the day you kicked me out. Since the day I walked in and saw you kissing my mom's sister in the kitchen. I want nothing to do with you, Tessa, or your child. Call me whatever you want, but we will never be a family again." His face fell. For the first time, I saw actual pain in his expression. But I didn't feel a single ounce of sympathy. Without another word, he turned and left. And that was that. Update 3. It's been 4 months since that confrontation. And now, I'm officially 18. To clarify, my dad hasn't contacted me since the last time he showed up at Elliot's house. My family still refuses to acknowledge him or Tessa. No one, not even out of curiosity, has gone to see his baby. And as for me, I'm starting college this year. I have a part-time job, so I don't need my dad's money. Elliot and my grandparents have all offered to support me if I ever need anything. And for the first time in years, I feel free. That's it. That's the whole story. No big dramatic ending. No last-minute redemption arc. Just the simple truth. I'm finally moving forward.